Hello, everybody. It's your old pal Jerry V here, and this is another installment of the Tales from the Stacks. If you guys have joined us before, you'll know that we read you guys a couple chapters from a selection of the Stacks here at the Lucero Library, brought to you by PCCLD. We have all of these books in the Stacks currently, so if you want to come and check them out, you're more than welcome to read along with us, read along with me, and we'll get you a couple chapters through. In this installment, we have been doing Stuart Little. I'd like to thank E.B. White. This is the person that wrote Charlotte's Web. I'd also like to give a big shout out to HarperCollins, the publishers, for letting us read you these stories during this time of pandemic. So thank you very much, HarperCollins. And I also like to give a big shout out to Miss Jessica. She's behind the scenes, so she's behind things. You guys don't see her, but thanks, Miss Jess. So without further ado, let's see how good my math is. V2. That is chapter 5. Roman numerals V2. Okay, chapter 5. The Sailboat Race. When the people in Central Park learned that one of the toy sailboats was being steered by a mouse in a sailor suit, they all came running. Soon the shores of the pond were crowded, and the policeman was sent from headquarters to announce that everyone would have to stop pushing, but no one did. People in New York like to push each other, but the most excited person of them all was the boy who owned the Lillian B. Wormrath. It was a fat, sulky boy of 12 named Leroy. He wore a blue serge suit with a white necktie stained with orange juice. "Come back here," he called to Stuart. "Come back here. Come get me my boat. I want you to steer my boat. I will pay you $5 a week, and you can have it every Thursday afternoon off, and a radio in your room." "I thank you for your kind offer," replied Stuart, "but I'm very happy aboard the Wasp. Happier than I had ever been before in all of my life." And with that, he spun the wheel and over smartly and headed his schooner down towards the starting line, where Leroy was turning his boat around by poking it with a long stick, ready for the start of the race. "I'll be the referee," said a man in a bright green suit. "Is the Wasp ready?" "Ready, sir," shouted Stuart, touching his hat. "Is the Lillian B. Wormrath ready?" asked the referee. "Sure is. I'm ready," said Leroy. "To the north end of the pool and back again," shouted the referee. "On your marks, get set, go!" "Go!" cried the people along the shore. "Go!" cried the owner of the Wasp. "Go!" yelled the policeman. And away went the two boats for the north end of the pond, while the seagulls wheeled and cried overhead, and the taxicabs tooted their horns from 72nd Street, and the West Wind, which had come halfway across America to get to Central Park, sang and whistled in ringing and blue spray across the decks, stinging Stuart's cheeks with tiny fragments of flying peanut shells tossed up from the foamy depths. "This is the life for me," Stuart murmured to himself. What a ship! What a day! What a race! Before the two boats had gone many feet, however, an accident had happened ashore. The people were pushing each other harder and harder to get to in their eagerness to see the spot that had already and really didn't mean to but they pushed the policeman so hard that he pushed him right off the concrete wall and into the pond. He hit the water in a sitting position and got wet clear up to the third button of his jacket. He was soaked. This particular policeman was not a big, heavy man, but he had just eaten a big, heavy meal, and the waves he had made curled upwards, cresting and billowing, upsetting all matters of small craft, and causing every owner of a boat in the pond to scream with delight and consternation. When Stuart saw the great wave approaching, he jumped from his rig, but it was too late. Towering above the Wasp like a mountain, the wave came crashing and piling along the deck, caught Stuart up and swept him over the side and into the water, where everybody supposed he would drown. Stuart had no intent of drowning. He kicked hard with his feet and thrashed hard with his tail, and in a minute or two he climbed back aboard the schooner, cold and wet, but quite unharmed. He took his place at the helm. He could hear people cheering for him and calling him, "Atta mouse, Stuart! Atta mouse!" He looked over and saw the wave had capsized the Lillian B. Wormwright, but that she had righted herself and was sailing on her course close by. And she was staying close alongside till both boats reached the north end of the pond. Here, Stuart pushed the Wasp about, and Leroy turned the Lillian around with his stick, and away the two boats went for the finish line. This race isn't over yet, thought Stuart. The first warning he had that he was in trouble ahead came when he glanced into the Wasp's cabin and observed that his barometer had fallen sharply. That could only mean one thing at sea: dirty weather. Suddenly, a dark cloud swept across the sun, blotting it out and leaving the earth in a shadow. Stuart shivered in his wet clothes. He turned up his sailor blouse even closer around his neck, and he spied the Wasp's owner along the crowded shore. He waved his hat and called out, "Dirty weather ahead, sir." Wind backing into the southwest, seas confused, glass falling. "Never mind the weather," cried the owner. "Watch out for flotsam dead ahead." I'll have to look what flotsam means. I don't know what that word means, everybody. I'll look it up. Don't worry. Stuart peered ahead and gathered into the gathering storm, but saw nothing except gray waves with a white crest. The world seemed cold and ominous. Stuart glanced behind him. There came the sloop boiling along fast, rolling up a bow wave and gaining steadily. "Look out, Stuart! Look out, or you're going..." Stuart strained his eyes, and suddenly, dead ahead, right in the path of the Wasp, he saw an enormous paper bag looming up in the surface of the pond. The bag was emptied and riding high, its open end gaping wide like the mouth of a cave. Stuart spun the wheel over, but it was too late. The Wasp drove her bow straight into the bag, and with a fearful whoosh, the schooner was swallowed up and came into the winds. with all of the sails flapping. Just at this moment, Stuart heard a splintering crash, saw the bow of Lillian's plow through his rig, and felt the whole ship tremble from stem to stern with the force of the collision. "A collision!" shouted the crowd on the shore. In a jiffy, the two boats were in a terrible tangle. Little boys on the shore screamed and danced up and down. Meanwhile, the paper bags sprang a leak and began to fill. The Wasp couldn't move because of the bag, and the Lillian B. Wormwraith couldn't move because her nose was stuck in the Wasp's rigging. Waving his arms, Stuart ran forward, and firing off his gun, he heard above from the voices on the shore. The voice of the Wasp was yelling directions and telling him what to do. "Stuart! Stuart! Down jib! Down staysail!" Stuart jumped from the hillyards and the jib, and the staysail came ripping down. "Cut away all the paper bags!" roared the owner. Stuart whipped out his pocket knife and slashed away bravely at the soggy bag until he had the deck cleared. "Now back for your foresail and give her a full," screamed the owner of the Wasp. Stuart grabbed the foresail boom and pulled with all of his might. Slowly, the schooner paid off and began to gather headway. And she headed over to the breeze and rolled her rail out from under the Lillian's nose, shook herself free, and stood away toward the south hard. A loud cheer went up from the bank. Stuart sprang to the wheel and answered it. Then he looked back, and with great joy, he perceived that the Lillian had gone off in a wild direction, and it was yawing all over the pond. Straight and true sailed the Wasp, Stuart at helm. After he crossed the finish line, Stuart brought her alongside the wall and was taken ashore and highly praised for his fine seamanship and daring. The owner was delighted and said it was the happiest day of his life. He introduced himself to Stuart, said that in his private life, he was Dr. Paul Carney, a surgeon dentist. He said model boats were his hobby, and he would be delighted if Stuart took command of his vessel any time. Everyone shook hands with Stuart. Everybody, that is, except the policeman, who was too wet and mad to shake hands with a mouse. When Stuart got home that night, his brother George asked him where he had been all day. "Oh, knocking around town," said Stuart. Chapter 8. Mar-a-Lago. Because he was so small, Stuart was often hard to find around the house. His father and mother and his brother George seldom could locate him just by looking for him. Usually they had to call him, and in the house often echoed with cries of "Stuart! Stuart!" You would come into the room and you might be curled up in a chair, but you wouldn't see him. Mr. Little was in constant fear of losing him and never finding him again. He made him a tiny red cap, such as hunters wear, so that he would be easier to see. One day, when he was 7 years old, Stuart was in the kitchen watching his mother make tapioca pudding. He was feeling hungry, and when little Stuart opened the door of the electric refrigerator, To get something, Stuart slipped inside to see if he could find himself a piece of cheese. He supposed, of course, his mother would see him. When she swung the door shut, he realized he was locked in. It surprised him greatly. "Help!" he cried. "It's dark in here. It's cold in the refrigerator. Help! Let me out! I'm getting colder by the minute." But his voice was not strong enough to penetrate the thick wall. In the darkness, he stumbled and fell into a saucer of prunes. The juice was cold. Stuart shivered and his teeth chattered together. It wasn't until a half hour later that Miss Little opened the door again and found him standing on the butter plate, beating his arms together, trying to keep warm, and blowing into his hands, and hopping up and down. "Mercy!" she cried. "Stuart, my poor little boy, how about a nip of brandy?" Said Stuart. "I'm chilled to the bone." But his mother made him some hot broth instead, and put him in bed in the cigarette box with a dull hot water bottle against his feet. Even so, Stuart caught a bad cold, and this turned into bronchitis, and Stuart had to stay in bed for almost 2 weeks. During his illness, his other members of his family were extremely kind to Stuart. Miss Little played tic-tac-toe with him. George made him a soap bubble pipe and a bow and arrow. Mr. Little made him a pair of ice skates and 2 pairs out of 2 paper clips. One cold afternoon, Miss Little was shaking off her dust cloth out the window, and she noticed a little bird was lying on the windowsill, apparently dead. She brought it in and put it near the radiator. In a short while, it fluttered its wings and opened its eyes. It was a pretty little hen bird, brown, with a streak of yellow on her breast. The Littles didn't agree on what kind of bird she was. "She's a walled-eyed Vero," said George scientifically. "I think she's more of a yellow wren," said Mr. Little. Anyway, they fixed a place for her in the living room, and fed her, and gave her a cup of water. Soon she felt much better and was hopping around the house, examining everything with great care and interest. Presently she hopped upstairs and into Stuart's room, where he was lying in bed. "Hello?" said Stuart. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" "My name is Margle," said the bird softly in a musical voice. "I came from fields once tall with wheat, from pastures deep in the ferns and thistle. I come from vales of meadow sweet, and I love to whistle." Stuart sat bolt up in his bed. "Say that again," he said. "I can't," repeated Margle. I have a sore throat." "So have I," said Stuart. "I have bronchitis." "You get better not getting you better not get near me, or you might catch it." "I'll stay right here by the door," said Margot. "You can use some of my garb if you want," said Stuart. "And here's some nose drops, and I have plenty of Kleenex." "Thank you very much. You are very kind," replied the bird. "Did they take your temperature?" asked Stuart, who began to genuinely worry about his new friend's health. "No," said Margot. Margello? Margalo. I don't know. I'm going to call her Margalo. Well, you guys call it whatever you want. That's Marglo. Marglo? I don't know. Marglo. But I don't think, and that will be necessary. Well, we better make sure, said Stuart, because I would hate to have anything happen to you. Here, and he tossed her a thermometer. Marglo put it under her tongue, and she and Stuart sat very still for 3 minutes. Then she took it out and looked at it, turned it slowly and carefully. Normal, she announced. Stuart felt his heart leap for gladness. It seemed to him he had never seen any creature so beautiful as this tiny bird, and he already loved her. I hope, he remarked, that my parents have fixed you up with a decent place to sleep. Oh, yes, Marglo replied. I'm going to sleep in the Boston Ferns on the bookshelf in the living room. It's a nice place for a city location. And now, if you'll excuse me, I think I shall go to bed. I see it's getting dark outside, and I always go to bed when at sundown. Good night, sir. Please don't call me sir, cried Stuart. Call me Stuart. Very well, said the bird. Good night, Stuart. And she hopped off with a light bouncing step. Good night, Marglo, called Stuart. See you in the morning. Stuart settled under the bedclothes again. There's a mighty fine bird, he whispered, and sighed in a tender sigh. When Mrs. Little came up in later to tuck Stuart in for the night and hear his prayers, Stuart asked her what she had thought of the bird, and if it would be quite safe sleeping down in the living room. Quite safe, my dear, she replied. What about the cat, Snowbell? Asked Stuart sternly. Snowbell won't touch that bird, her mother said. You go to sleep and forget all about it. Miss Little opened the window and turned out the lights. Stuart closed his eyes, laid there in the dark, but he couldn't seem to go to sleep. He tossed and turned, and the bedclothes got all rumpled up. He kept thinking about the bird downstairs asleep in the fern. He kept thinking about Snowball and about the way that Snowbell's eyes gleamed. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, he switched on the light. There's just something in me that doesn't trust a cat, he muttered. I can't sleep knowing that Marglo is in danger. Pushing the covers back, Stuart climbed out of bed. He put on his wrapper and slippers. Taking his bow and arrow and his flashlight, he tiptoed out into the hall. Everyone had gone back to bed and the house was dark. Stuart found his way down to the stairs and descended slowly and cautiously into the living room, making no noise. His throat hurt him, but he felt a little dizzy. Sick as I am, he said to himself, this has got to be done. Being careful not to make a sound, he stole across by the lamp by the bookshelf, shinnied up the cord, and climbed onto the shelf. There was a faint ray of light from the street lamp outside, and Stuart could dimly see Marglo, asleep in the fern, her head tucked under her wing. Sleep well upon thine eyes, peace in thy breast, he whispered. repeating a speech that he had heard in the movies. Then he hid behind the candlestick and waited, listening and watching. For a half an hour, he saw nothing, heard nothing but the faint ruffles of Margot's feathers when she stirred in dreams. The clock struck 10 loudly, and before the sound of the last stroke had died away, Stuart saw two gleaming yellow eyes peering out from behind the sofa. So, thought Stuart, I guess there's going to be something done after all. He reached down for his bow and arrow. The eyes came near. Stuart was frightened, but he was a very brave mouse, even when he had a sore throat. He placed the arrow against the cord of the bow and waited. Snowball crept softly towards the bookshelf and climbed noiselessly into the chair with ease. Reaching the bottom of the Boston fern where Margot was asleep, then he crouched, ready to spring. His tail waved back and forth. His eyes gleamed bright. Stuart decided the time had come. He stepped out from behind the candlestick, knelt down, bent his bow, and took careful aim at Snowball's left ear, which was the closest to him. This was the finest thing I have ever done, thought Stuart, and he shot the arrow straight into the cat's ear. Snowball squealed with pain and jumped down, ran off towards the kitchen. Direct hit, said Stuart. Thank heaven. Well, there's a good night's work done. And he threw a kiss towards Margot's sleeping form. It was a tired mouse that crawled into a bed a few minutes later, tired, but ready for sleep at last. Whoa, Stuart's having himself a little adventure. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this. I hope to see you all join me again on the next installment of the Tales from the Stacks. It's been my pleasure to read for you all. If you like this book, they do movies and there's other renditions of this. You can find it book on tape. If you don't want to read it, if you want somebody to read it better than me, they pay people lots of money to do this. We have books on tape of this. If you want to practice reading it yourself, this has some words that you don't use every day. So it's good to help extend your vocabulary. So
that word was
Miss Jessica says that word is something. What are you saying, Miss Jessica?
wreckage.
Wreckage. Oh, it's a wreckage. So that word that I was like, wasn't sure what it was when he was going through the sailboat experience. It's wreckage. Thank you, Miss Jessica, for looking that up for me. I appreciate you. No worries, Miss Jessica. She's the best. So thank you for that small piece of information. She's the brains behind the experience. So for me, Jerry Vigil here at the Lucero Library, that's all the time I have. Thank you for joining me on Tales from the Stacks. Tune in for other cool and exciting programs and things offered from PCCLD and your friends here at the Lucero Library. So with Jerry V, peace out.